My name is Lucas Bennett. I'm 41 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the man behind the curtain of one of the most exclusive luxury hotel and resort chains in the world. Before we go any further, drop a quick comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that like button. It helps more than you know. People see the glossy brochures, the magazine covers with my wife's face, the interviews where she's called the visionary CEO. But what they don't see is me. Because I've always chosen to stay out of the spotlight. That was my decision, my comfort zone, and as I would later learn, my greatest mistake. Victoria, my wife of nearly 15 years, was beautiful, charismatic, and sharp. When we first started the business together, she was the natural choice to be the public face. She could walk into a boardroom full of seasoned investors and leave them nodding before she even sat down. Me? I was better with numbers, contracts, and negotiations, the kind that happened far from cameras. Together, we built an empire. Or at least, that's what I thought. Our headquarters sat in a glass tower overlooking the harbor, the kind of place where the elevator ride felt like an ascent into another world. I didn't go in every day. My work could be done from my private office at home or from any of our resorts around the globe. But lately, every time I walked through those revolving doors, something felt different. Conversations would stop when I entered a room. Sideways glances, forced smiles, and half-finished sentences became the norm. At first, I told myself it was paranoia, that maybe the staff was intimidated by me, the ghost owner who rarely appeared in person. But then I noticed something else. My half-brother Ethan seemed to be spending more and more time around the office. Ethan had always been the charming one in the family. Slick, smooth-talking, and allergic to hard work. The kind of guy who'd show up at a family barbecue in an expensive suit and pretend it was because he just came from a meeting. The thing was, Ethan didn't have a job at our company. He'd never had one anywhere. So why was he here? And why was Victoria suddenly bringing his name up in casual conversation? It started subtly. A mention that Ethan had great ideas for our marketing strategy. A casual remark about how Ethan thinks the company could modernize in a few ways. I'd laugh it off, but a knot would form in my stomach. He was inserting himself into my life through the one thing I had always kept secure, my business. One evening, I came home early from a property inspection overseas. My flight landed ahead of schedule, and I didn't tell Victoria I was back. I walked into our penthouse, expecting to find her at the piano or curled up with one of her mystery novels. Instead, I heard voices in the dining room. I slowed my steps, staying out of sight. "He's comfortable," Ethan was saying, his tone dripping with contempt. "Too comfortable. He doesn't even realize how outdated his thinking is. We could double profits in a year if he just got out of the way." Victoria's voice was lower, almost hesitant. "You think the board would go for it?" Ethan chuckled. "With the right push, they'll beg for it." I stood there for a moment, letting their words sink in. This wasn't about ideas or modernization. This was about control. About removing me from the very empire I had built from scratch. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I quietly backed away, slipped out of the apartment and into the night. If they wanted to play a game, I was going to learn the rules before making my move. Because one thing Ethan never understood about me is that I don't fight to win, I fight to finish. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, not because I couldn't sleep, though I barely had, but because old habits die hard. Years ago, when I was building the first hotel from the ground up, I learned that the quiet hours before the world wakes up are when the clearest decisions are made. That morning, I decided I wasn't going to react impulsively. No yelling, no dramatic confrontations. That's what Ethan would expect, what he would want. Instead, I would listen, watch, and prepare. I went into my study, a warm space lined with dark walnut shelves and leather-bound books, and unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside were decades of documents, contracts, share certificates,
agreements that spelled out, in precise legal terms, exactly who owned what. I had never needed to use them as leverage before, but now, just knowing they were there, felt like armor. Ethan had always underestimated me. People like him see quiet men as weak. They think a calm demeanor means you're not paying attention. But I had built my entire career on listening more than I spoke, on knowing exactly when to reveal the cards in my hand. For the next few weeks, I deliberately made myself scarce. I let Victoria and Ethan believe they were gaining ground. I skipped a couple of board meetings, sending my assistant in my place. I responded to emails with polite, vague acknowledgments, and, most importantly, I kept every single piece of communication: texts, emails, voicemails. A pattern was forming, and I wanted every word documented. One afternoon, I arranged to meet with Daniel Morgan, my oldest friend, and the company's lead counsel. Daniel wasn't just my lawyer. He was the man who had been there when I signed the very first purchase agreement for the hotel that started it all. We met at a quiet cafe far from the corporate district. I slid my phone across the table and let him read through the latest string of messages from Ethan to Victoria, messages I had intercepted from a shared office tablet. When Daniel looked up, his expression was unreadable. "They're setting you up for a vote of no confidence," he said finally. "It's clumsy, but they think if they rally enough of the board, they can oust you." I nodded. "And?" He smirked. "And they clearly don't know the bylaws you wrote yourself. The CEO position is tied directly to majority ownership. You own 62%. Even if they turned every other board member against you, they can't remove you without your consent." Hearing him say it out loud was like feeling the lock click on a safe. The power they thought they were stealing was never theirs to take. Still, that didn't mean I was going to stop them just yet. No, there was value in letting them walk further into the trap. That night, Victoria came home late. I was in the living room, sipping a glass of scotch, pretending to be absorbed in the muted flicker of the TV. She kissed my cheek, absently, her phone still in her hand. I caught the faintest whiff of Ethan's cologne. "You're up late," she said. I smiled. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, half interested. "About how quickly things can change in business." I replied. She didn't notice the weight behind my words. In the days that followed, I started feeding small pieces of information into conversations, mentions of a potential restructuring, whispers of a major acquisition. I knew Ethan wouldn't be able to resist running to the board with half-baked intel, eager to prove his value. And when he did, it would only highlight just how unprepared and reckless he really was. I wasn't just preparing for the final meeting. I was building the stage for it.
It didn't take long for Ethan to take the bait. Men like him have one fatal flaw. They confuse opportunity with entitlement. Within a week, I started hearing from trusted contacts on the board, people who had been with me since the first resort opened, that Ethan was sharing concerns about my leadership. He wasn't subtle. He claimed I was distracted, disengaged, and unwilling to modernize. He even threw in a line about me resting on past success, which, frankly, made me laugh. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. Every word he spread was being repeated back to me within hours. That was the benefit of years spent building loyalty the right way. The board members he thought he could sway were the same people whose careers I'd quietly supported, whose families I'd helped during hard times, whose trust I had earned without asking for it in return. But Ethan didn't see that. All he saw was a glossy chair at the head of the boardroom table, and he was determined to sit in it. Victoria was no longer even trying to hide her involvement.
She started missing dinners, taking calls in the other room, and speaking about our vision when she met hers and Ethan's. I'd watch her across the table. Her eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. Not for me, not for us, but for the idea of finally stepping into the role she believed she deserved. One Thursday afternoon, I walked into the headquarters unannounced. The receptionists straightened in their seats, unsure whether to greet me warmly or cautiously. I went straight to the executive floor. The glass doors to the boardroom were closed, but I could hear voices inside. Ethan's loud, confident tone and Victoria's softer, strategic one. "He doesn't have the energy for this anymore," Ethan was saying. "We need someone who can take this brand into the next decade." "And if he resists?" a board member asked. Ethan laughed. "We'll make it impossible for him to stay." I could have opened the door right then, but I didn't. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked away. That meeting wasn't the moment I was waiting for. I wanted them fully committed to their plan before I dismantled it. Later that evening, I met Daniel again, this time in his office. I handed him a manila folder thick with contracts, board bylaws, and ownership agreements. I told him, if they call a vote, I want you ready to shut it down before it even begins. He skimmed the top document and smiled. "This'll be over faster than they expect." "Not too fast," I said. "I want them to think they've won before they find out they haven't." The next day, Ethan made his move. He called for a special meeting of the board, framing it as a discussion about leadership direction. His tone in the email was polished, almost respectful, but the subtext was clear. He was rallying his allies. What he didn't know was that I had already secured my own allies, the ones whose votes actually mattered. Victoria seemed almost giddy that evening, as if she couldn't wait for the inevitable. "Big day tomorrow," she said as she poured herself a glass of wine. I nodded. "Yes, a very big day." She didn't catch the hint. She was too busy rehearsing her victory speech in her head, no doubt imagining the applause and the congratulations that would follow. As I sat back in my chair, I thought about the morning to come. They would walk into that boardroom certain that they had orchestrated my downfall. They'd have the smug confidence of people who believe the fight is already over. And when the truth landed, it would hit harder than any argument I could make. Because tomorrow, they'd learn that you don't take a man's empire when the man still holds the keys.
The morning of the meeting, I arrived earlier than anyone expected. The boardroom was still dark, the city skyline just beginning to glow through the wall of glass behind the head chair. I took my seat at the far end of the table, not the one reserved for the CEO, but the one I had always chosen when I wanted to watch without being watched. Daniel was already there, a quiet shadow in a tailored suit, a leather briefcase at his side. "You're sure you want to let them go first?" he asked. "Absolutely," I said. "They've been rehearsing for weeks. Let's give them their stage." One by one, the board members filtered in, familiar faces, some smiling warmly, others keeping their expressions neutral. Then came Victoria, her hair styled to perfection, her tailored suit an exact match to the company's brand colors. And, right on cue, Ethan followed, wearing a smug grin that seemed almost too big for his face. He shook hands with two of the directors like a politician greeting donors. When the last seat was filled, Ethan stood. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, voice full of false humility. "We called this special meeting because our beloved company is at a crossroads. We have an incredible brand, a loyal customer base, and a global presence. But," he paused, letting the silence hang, "we also have leadership that is no longer aligned with the future we envision." I watched him pace slowly, hands gesturing like a man delivering a TED Talk. "Lucas has been the backbone of this company for years. No one denies that. But lately, his absence has been noticeable. Decisions have been delayed, opportunities missed. We believe it's time for a transition." A murmur moved through the room. Victoria stood next, adding her own layer to the speech.
"This isn't about pushing anyone out," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. "It's about positioning the company for the next decade. New energy, new ideas, new leadership. And we believe Ethan can help guide that transition." I could see them both trying to keep the tone polished, professional, even generous. But underneath it, there was an eagerness they couldn't hide. They thought this was already done. When they finished, Ethan turned toward me with mock courtesy. "Lucas, would you like to respond?" I stood slowly, letting the chair legs scrape the floor. I didn't look at Ethan or Victoria right away. Instead, I made eye contact with each board member, one at a time. Then, I reached into my briefcase and placed a thick folder in the center of the table. "I appreciate your concern for the company," I said calmly, "but before we discuss leadership changes, there are a few facts that should be clarified." I opened the folder, sliding copies of the bylaws, shared distribution agreements, and CEO appointment conditions to each board member. "These documents," I continued, "make it very clear that the position of CEO is tied directly to majority ownership. And, as of this morning, I still hold 62% of this company." Ethan's smile faltered. Victoria's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "In addition," I went on, "any change to the CEO position requires the majority owner's approval. That means, even if every other person in this room voted to remove me, it would not, legally, be possible without my consent." Silence. Not the polite kind, but the heavy kind that comes when the air is knocked out of a room. I glanced at Daniel, who leaned forward slightly. "From a legal standpoint," he said evenly, "this meeting has no authority to alter leadership without Mr. Bennett's approval, which, for the record, has not been given." I closed the folder. "Now, shall we talk about the real future of this company?" For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside. Ethan's jaw worked like he was chewing over his next move, but nothing came out. Finally, he forced a smile that looked more like a wince. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "that's interesting. But, Lucas, surely you can see this isn't personal. We're just thinking about what's best for the company." I leaned back in my chair, calm as ever. "I agree," I said, "which is exactly why we're going to address something that is personal. Unqualified individuals inserting themselves into operations they neither understand nor have earned a place in." My eyes didn't leave his, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt in his expression. Victoria shifted in her seat. "Lucas, I think you're overreacting. Ethan has been bringing in valuable perspectives." "From where?" I interrupted, not raising my voice, but letting the words cut. "From his years of running what exactly? Because last time I checked, you don't run a luxury hotel empire by showing up for free drinks at the lobby bar." A few board members stifled smiles. It wasn't the kind of room where people laughed out loud, but the tension was cracking. Ethan straightened his shoulders. "I'm here because I care about the future of this company." I slid another document across the cable. "If that were true, you wouldn't have been sending these." Inside were printed copies of the emails he'd sent to Victoria, emails where he talked openly about pushing me out and taking over the top seat. I hadn't needed to embellish a thing. His own words were enough to sink him. A low murmur rippled around the table. Victoria's face drained of color. "Where did you get those?" she asked quietly. "I'm the majority owner," I replied simply. "I have access to everything that touches this company's network, including shared office devices. And while we're on the subject of access, Victoria, do you recall the clause in your CEO appointment contract about maintaining alignment with the board chair?" Her lips parted, but no words came. "It's right here," I said, tapping another page in the folder. "Failure to maintain that alignment voids the appointment, effective immediately." Daniel spoke up then, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel. "Mr. Bennett is within his rights to revoke the CEO appointment today. Unless there's any legal objection from this board, the motion is enacted." No one objected. No one even looked like they wanted to. I stood, buttoning my jacket. This company will move forward, but it will do so with leadership that has earned its place and understands the value of loyalty. My gaze swept the room, landing last on Ethan. And for the record, loyalty isn't something you buy with $100 bills and cheap insults. He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. Meeting adjourned. I walked out to the hallway, Daniel close behind. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. As we reached the elevator, Daniel glanced at me. That was surgical. I allowed myself a small smile. It's not about making noise, it's about making it impossible for them to move again. The doors slid shut, cutting off the muffled voices still murmuring in the boardroom. The fight was over, at least in that room. But I knew people like Ethan and Victoria didn't walk away quietly. There would be fallout. And I was ready for it.
Fallout has a way of spreading faster than the truth. By the end of the day, whispers had already made their way through every floor of the headquarters. People didn't have the details yet, but they knew something big had happened in the boardroom. And they knew Ethan and Victoria had walked out looking nothing like victors. I didn't go back to my office. Instead, I took Daniel's advice and stayed off-site, working from the small study in my home. It wasn't about hiding. It was about controlling the narrative. The fewer opportunities they had to confront me in person, the more desperate their moves would become. By mid-afternoon, my phone started buzzing. First, it was a text from Victoria. "We need to talk. You're making a mistake." I ignored it. Then came Ethan. "You blindsided us. This isn't over." That one earned a faint smile. He still didn't understand that the moment he handed me $100 in front of the board, it had been over for him. Around 3 o'clock, an email from the company's PR director landed in my inbox. Apparently, Victoria had been making calls to key industry contacts, framing the board meeting as a mutual decision to restructure leadership. It was a weak attempt to save face, but I didn't stop her. Sometimes letting someone cling to their version of the story keeps them from realizing just how far they've already fallen. That evening, I met with the senior operations team, people who actually kept the company running. We gathered in a quiet, private dining room at one of our flagship hotels. The atmosphere was cautious at first, but when I made it clear that nothing in their positions or projects would change, shoulders began to relax. This company was built on trust, I told them, and trust doesn't get traded or replaced when it's inconvenient. We're moving forward, stronger. They didn't ask about Victoria or Ethan, and I didn't bring them up. There was no need. The best way to erase someone's influence is to stop saying their name. 2 days later, Ethan tried a different approach. He called me directly, his voice dripping with manufactured calm. "Lucas, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Maybe we can work something out. I still believe I can be a valuable asset to the company." I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "Ethan," I said finally, "the company isn't a charity, and I don't hire people who try to steal from me. We're done." He didn't take that well. Within hours, I heard from security that he'd been seen in the lobby trying to gain access to the executive floor. His pass had been deactivated the moment the board meeting ended, so all he got for his trouble was an awkward escort out by building security. Victoria kept her distance longer, but eventually she too reached out. Her tone was softer than Ethan's, almost pleading. She wanted to meet just to talk. I declined. Our lawyers could handle any necessary communication. The truth was, the fight wasn't about the company anymore. It was about boundaries. I'd given both of them the benefit of doubt for far too long. That generosity had been repaid with betrayal. Now, every decision I made would be rooted in protecting what I'd built and the people who had proven they deserved to be part of it.
By the end of the week, internal reports showed a sharp uptick in productivity. It was as if the entire company had taken a deep breath now that the tension was gone. That was the thing about removing the wrong people. It doesn't just fix the problem. It sends a message. And I was far from done sending mine.
The week after the boardroom showdown was a study in quiet reconstruction. The first order of business was securing the walls around what I'd built, metaphorically and literally. I called Daniel into my office and handed him a list of action points. It wasn't long, but it was decisive. First, we amended the corporate bylaws to make my majority ownership even harder to dilute. Any future share transfers would require unanimous board approval and my direct signature. No loopholes, no proxy votes, no accidental clauses. Second, we restructured the executive leadership pipeline, introducing a formal vetting process that ensured no one without relevant experience could hold an operational role. Ethan's little advisor stint would have never passed such a filter, and now it never could. Daniel looked over the list, nodding slowly. "You're locking the gates?" "I'm making sure there are no more back doors," I replied. Meanwhile, word of what had happened started to spread beyond the walls of our company. Industry contacts began reaching out, not for gossip, but to reaffirm partnerships. A few even admitted they'd been approached by Ethan or Victoria in recent months with new project proposals. Those conversations stopped cold once they realized who still signed the checks. Victoria had officially stepped down as CEO. The press release phrased in polite, vague terms about pursuing other opportunities. Behind the scenes, her attempts to line up a similar role at another hospitality group fizzled quickly. This industry had a long memory, and her association with Ethan was now public enough to raise eyebrows everywhere she went. Ethan's descent was quicker. Without access to our resources, his lifestyle, built entirely on appearances, started to crack. He sold his sports car within 2 weeks. The networking dinners dried up, replaced by quiet nights in places far less glamorous than the resorts he'd once strutted through. I wasn't watching them out of spite. It was more like confirming the forecast after a storm. You see the debris, you note the damage, and you move on. But I wasn't naive. I knew people like them didn't just disappear. They circled, waiting for another chance. That was why my final safeguard had to be more than legal. It had to be cultural. I began hosting small, off-the-record retreats with my top managers. No suits, no rigid agendas, just open conversation about what kind of company we wanted to be 5, 10, 20 years from now. I wanted loyalty not because it was written in a contract, but because it was built into the fabric of who we were. One night, during the first of these retreats at our flagship island resort, I stood on the terrace looking out over the water. Daniel joined me, a glass of wine in hand. "You know," he said, "most people in your position would have gone scorched earth. Public humiliation, lawsuits, the works." I kept my eyes on the horizon. Public humiliation is temporary. Silence, that lasts forever. People fill in the blanks themselves, and the story they tell usually makes the ending even better. He chuckled. "And Ethan and Victoria? They've already told everyone exactly who they are. All I had to do was give them the stage." By the time I flew back to the mainland, the company's internal culture felt different, lighter, focused. I'd stopped a coup without raising my voice, and in doing so, reminded everyone exactly why this empire had endured for so long. But there was still one final piece to put in place, a way to ensure that if Ethan or Victoria ever tried to step into my world again, they'd find the doors locked long before they reached them. And I knew exactly when and where I was going to make that clear. 2 months later, the annual shareholders gala arrived. It was the one event where everyone who mattered to the company gathered under one roof. Investors, partners, longtime employees, and a select group of media. The ballroom of our flagship hotel was dressed in gold and white, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over polished marble floors.
It wasn't just a celebration, it was a statement of stability, success, and vision. I arrived early, shaking hands, making small talk, letting the night build naturally. People were relaxed, enjoying the champagne, confident in the direction we were heading. That was exactly how I wanted it. But I had one more card to play, and this was the perfect stage. As dinner plates were cleared, I stepped up to the podium. The room quieted, the soft clink of silverware fading. Tonight, I began, is about celebrating what we've built together. But it's also about where we're going next. I spoke of new resort openings, partnerships in emerging markets, and our commitment to innovation without compromising the standards that had made us leaders in luxury hospitality. Then I paused, letting the silence gather just enough weight. Over the past year, I continued, we've been reminded of how important it is to protect not just our assets, but our integrity. This company will never be vulnerable to those who think leadership is a title you can take, rather than a responsibility you must earn. And to that end, I'm announcing a new executive charter. At my cue, Daniel handed out leather-bound copies to the key shareholders and board members. Inside were the amended bylaws, leadership appointment rules, and a newly formalized succession plan, one that required a unanimous vote from a select council, all handpicked by me, to approve any future CEO. It was a fortress in legal form, and everyone in the room knew it. This, I said, ensures that our leadership will always be in the hands of those who have earned the trust of this family, because that's what we are, a family. Polite applause filled the room, but I caught the flicker of recognition on a few faces. They understood exactly why this was being done now. The timing wasn't an accident. And then I saw them, standing just inside the entrance, as if they'd slipped past the registration desk, were Ethan and Victoria. She was dressed in deep red, her posture still regal, though her eyes betrayed the strain of the past weeks. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit like it used to. They lingered by the doorway, maybe hoping for a chance to mingle, to be seen, to reclaim some scrap of relevance. But security was already moving toward them. I didn't call them out, didn't even glance their way again. The message had already been delivered, without a single word exchanged. After they were quietly escorted out, I continued my speech, as if nothing had happened. The gala went on, laughter and conversation filling the air. Deals were discussed, old friendships rekindled, and new partnerships born. Later that night, standing alone on the balcony overlooking the city, I felt the weight lift completely. This wasn't just about winning, it was about closing the door so firmly that no one could ever pretend it was still open. Ethan and Victoria had thought they could take what wasn't theirs. They'd underestimated the patience of a man who understood that power isn't about making noise. It's about making sure your silence speaks louder than any threat. And as I looked out at the lights of the city, I knew one thing for certain. The empire was exactly where it belonged, with the real CEO.